Today's presentation is about the crucifixion and resurrection of Yahusha. Please note this so you're not confused. In my presentations, I'm using the English letters YHVH or the Hebrew letters Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, pronounced as Yahuwah instead of the Lord, which is a title and not a name and is being applied to every false god. I'm using Yahusha instead of Jesus, which is not a translation, but a transliteration from a Greek mistransliteration and really has no meaning, neither in Hebrew nor in English. By the way, Jesus never existed, but was created in the 3rd century by Constantine, who was a sun worshipper until his death. Yahuwah and Yahusha are the actual original names, the true nature and character of them. Just look at Psalm 68:4. Yah is his name. Hallelujah is what people are singing. And it states in Psalm 68:4, in the Sefer translation, extol him that rides above the heavens by his name Yah. Now back to our presentation about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Yahusha. Yahusha said in John 8:32, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Now the question, free from what? Free from organized man-made religion and the doctrines and commandments of men. Don't forget, the fact that we believe something to be true does not make it true. Truth is truth whether we believe it or not. Truth stands on its own. The search of the scriptures on today's topic is important, not because it may affect salvation, but because it answers the questions posed on whether Yahusha kept his word and whether his word is true in this matter or not. However, after all the evidence has been presented, people still can believe whatever they choose to believe. We do have a choice. Like Benjamin Franklin once stated, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. The question is, was Yahusha crucified on a Wednesday, on a Thursday, or on a Friday? And does it matter? Was Yahusha resurrected on a Sunday or on a weekly Sabbath? What is fact? What is fiction? Do we really know? The three most popular points of view are Friday crucifixion, early Sunday morning resurrection. First, Yahusha died on Friday. Mark 15:42, Preparation Day. Second, the third day, Matthew 16:21, requirement is met if the days are counted inclusively. The 3-night specification is not met. Now let's look at this. Inclusive reckoning. This method of calculation uses inclusive reckoning of time, where the events that use only a portion of the 24-hour day are counted as a full 24-hour period. While this method of inclusive reckoning was often used to establish the years of rule by leaders and kings, it is not applicable to be used for the literal reckoning of time for prophetic timelines, especially a timeline about our Messiah, uttered by the Messiah himself. An example, when inclusive reckoning of time is used for civil purposes. If a leader, king, comes to the throne during the last month of the civil year, they were accounted as having ruled the full year of 12 months. He may be in a leadership position for only 13 months, but would be accounted as reigning for a full 24 months. Prophetic timeline of 3 days and 3 nights. This is a timeline of 3 full 24-hour days, with a total of 72 hours in all to fulfill the prophetic timeline. Result of Friday crucifixion and Sunday resurrection. At the most, this can only count for 48 hours, not even close to 72 hours for a complete fulfillment. Why? Thursday, crucifixion, early Sunday morning, resurrection. Number one, it fits the third day requirement if the days are counted inclusively. Thursday is counted through Saturday night. Number two, it makes Friday the unleavened bread high Sabbath, putting two Sabbaths together. Now the Wednesday death at 3 p.m. and Sabbath p.m. 3 p.m. resurrection. Number one, it fulfills the 3 days and nights for a length of the prophetic timeline, Matthew 12:40. Note, we will not be discussing the phrase "in the heart of the earth" in this study. Number two, it fits the after 3 days, according to Matthew 27:63. Number three, it allows for the purchase and preparation of spices on Friday, the day between the Thursday unleavened bread Sabbath and Saturday Sabbath, Mark 16:1, Luke 23:27. Number four, this teaching coincides with Wednesday, the midst of the week, according to Daniel 9:27, when sacrifices and oblations would cease. Only one can be right. The Christian Church has traditionally spoken of Good Friday as the day on which the Messiah was crucified and buried, with the resurrection taking place on the following Sunday. Several alternate views have been voiced as to which day of the week the crucifixion took place. Millions of professing Christians gather for Easter sunrise services every year. Even many who rarely go to church at any other time will attend worship services at the church of their choice on Easter Sunday. But did you know that Good Friday and Easter resurrection is a tradition. Why? Because the Bible nowhere makes a claim that the true Messiah rose from the dead on a Sunday morning. That is tradition. So, where did the tradition of Good Friday start? That's a good question we want to answer. For the first 3 centuries, Christians did not celebrate the death of Messiah on Friday. They did not even celebrate the resurrection on Sunday. They celebrated the day of the resurrection based on the Passover on the 14th day of the first Jewish month. Thus, Resurrection Day would fall on different days depending on the day of the Passover. It wasn't until the Emperor Constantine fixed the day of Easter to Sunday after the first full moon of spring. This was Constantine's idea to make Easter correspond with Passover. After setting Easter on Sunday, the church leaders made an honest mistake by assuming the death of Messiah was on Friday. They came to that conclusion based on the fact that Yahusha died the day before the weekly Sabbath, Saturday. Mark 15:42, John 19:31 confirms that Yahusha died on the preparation day, the day prior to the high Sabbath. Yahusha's Passover on Wednesday was followed by the high Sabbath of unleavened bread on Thursday. The sign of Yahusha's messiahship. There are many proofs that Yahusha of Nazareth was the Messiah promised in the Old Testament. The blind received their sight, the lame walked, the lepers were cleansed, the deaf heard, the dead were raised, and the poor received the gospel. See Matthew 11, 2-6. John's Gospel records that Yahusha performed a number of remarkable signs, beginning with the marriage feast at Cana, where he turned water into wine. John 2:11. Yahusha did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in a book, but these were written that you may believe that Yahusha is the Messiah, the Son of Elohim, and that believing you may have life in his name. John 20:30-31. Yahusha's disciples witnessed these signs, which confirmed their faith that he was, indeed, the promised Messiah. From the very beginning of Yahusha's public ministry, the religious leaders were aware of his message and the signs that confirmed his authority. However, they still came to him several times to demand a sign that would establish once and for all that he was the Messiah. On each of these occasions, Yahusha told them that only one such sign would be given to them. John records in John 2:19-21, when Yahusha cleansed the temple by chasing out the money changers, he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But he was speaking of the temple of his body. How many signs? Matthew records a similar exchange. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered and saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Only one sign. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Matthew 12:38-40. Note that Yahusha was referring to Hebrew usage, not Greek. He specifically connected his stay in the tomb with that of Jonah in the fish's belly. Now Yahuwah had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. See Jonah 1:17. Note Jonah 1:12. And he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me. The prophetic timeline of Jonah began when he uttered to the seamen to throw him into the sea. Upon that point is when the 3 days and 3 nights began for Jonah's journey in the great fish, and when that timeline was completed, the fish spat Jonah out upon the dry land. Jonah 2:10. How does that compare to Yahusha and his timeline of 3 days and 3 nights? John 19:30 tells us when to begin Yahusha's prophetic timeline. When Yahusha therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Luke 23:44-46. Yahusha dies on the cross. Also see Matthew 27:45-56, Mark 15:33-41, and John 19:25-30. Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Yahusha had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. A very important note. By the proclamation of the Gospels, Yahusha gave up his ruach, his spirit, about the 9th hour, that is 3 p.m. Roman time, and died. At that moment is when the prophetic timeline of 3 days and 3 nights began to tick away. The 72 hours under the ruach would enter his dead body, resurrecting him to life again. This 72 hours ended on the Saturday Sabbath at 3 p.m. Of course, not one of the Gospel writers was there to witness the event, so they could not record this resurrection time, as they were not an eyewitness. But let us remember Matthew 28:11 records what the guards did witness. Through all of this we know the day of the week was Wednesday, as that is the only day that qualifies for the midst of the week according to Daniel 9:27. Just as Jonah's prophetic timeline began, when he commanded the seamen to throw him into the sea, Yahusha's literal time of absence from this earth began when he uttered, "It is finished," and hung his head and died. Another note: while many believe this 3 days and 3 nights has something to do upon entrance into the tomb for burial, this is not true either. As with a full and complete study, Yahusha was not placed in the tomb until just moments before the dawn appeared, ushering in the high Sabbath of unleavened bread. As previously mentioned, this particular study will not be addressing the term "in the heart of the earth" at this time, as it has nothing to do with this particular timeline of 3 days and 3 nights. More information on the expression 3 days and 3 nights. The same expression was used when Queen Esther told her cousin Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day." That's in Esther 4:16. Each of these accounts was clearly describing a period of 72 hours, 3 days and 3 nights. This is exactly what Yahusha meant, and the Pharisees knew it. Notice how they quoted his statement to Pilate, the Roman governor, the next morning. "Sir, we remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.'" See Matthew 27:63. The Pharisees knew that Yahusha was not talking about a mere day and a half, but rather indicating 3 full days. Consider what is at stake in Yahusha's statement in Matthew 12:39-40. He places his entire identity on the line with his sign. If he failed his only sign, then he is not our Savior, and nothing he said can be trusted. If his prophecy of this sign failed, then he must be considered a false prophet. Satan wants to deny that Yahusha was the Messiah. For that reason he would seek to relegate the story of Jonah and the whale to folklore, myth, symbolism, and superstition. If this miracle of 3 days and 3 nights never occurred, then Yahusha's sign, based entirely upon it, is nothing more than hollow and pointless allegory. Yahusha's body had to be miraculously preserved. Psalm 16:10 says, "For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption." It takes 6 hours after death before a body will show corruption. After 2 days, Hosea 6:1-3. Come, let us return to Yahuwah, for he has torn us, but he will heal us. He has wounded us, but he will bandage us. He will revive us after 2 days. He will raise us up on the third day, that we may live before him. Hosea 13:14 says, I will ransom them from the power of Sheol, the pit of corruption. I will redeem them from death. O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, Where is your sting? Death in any face is a pit of corruption. Yahusha is our Messiah. He did fulfill the only sign given, the 3-day and 3-night prophecy. It is only misunderstandings and the traditions of men that have caused us to believe otherwise. The question is, what day was the crucifixion? Many will say, doesn't the Bible say that Yahusha was crucified and buried on Friday, and that the tomb was empty on Sunday morning? It is correct that the tomb was empty on Sunday morning. However, the tomb was empty long before that, at 3 p.m. on Sabbath. The Bible nowhere speaks of a Friday crucifixion. It does say that he was crucified on the Friday preparation day, Mark 15:42-45. We must recognize the Gospels also refer to the Passover day as the preparation day for the unleavened bread Sabbath that followed. Remember, the Bible speaks of annual Sabbaths or holy days in addition to the weekly Sabbaths. Look at Leviticus 23, verses 4, 7, 24, and 27 to 32. Yahusha was crucified on the Wednesday, Passover, preparation day, before an annual Sabbath, during the daily portion of the Passover on Abib 14 of his covenant calendar. The following day, Abib 15, is always an annual holy day, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In summary, Yahusha was resurrected on the weekly Sabbath in the afternoon at 3 p.m., exactly 72 hours after his proclaimed time of death. Then at Sunday morning sunrise, when the women came to add fragrant spices and ointments to his bodies, they found he was already risen, according to the instructions of the angels. They did not see the resurrection, they saw an empty tomb. As this group of women left to return to the city, Yahusha actually met them and encouraged them to tell his people he had risen. Yahusha came as a Lamb of Elohim to pay the penalty for sin, according to John 1:29. Paul declared in 1 Corinthians 5:7, "For indeed Messiah our Passover was sacrificed for us." A careful study of the Gospel accounts show that Yahusha and his disciples ate a meal of celebration that is known as the Lord's Supper in the King James Version Gospels. At this meal, Yahusha instituted the new emblems that were to be used instead of the usual Passover meal that contained the flesh of a roasted lamb. This was not a Passover meal, eaten on the evening of Abib 13, Tuesday. The Passover meals were always eaten during the evening of Abib 14. See Mark 14, 16 to 18, Luke 22, 13 to 15, and then Exodus 12, 1 to 8. Later that evening, on Abib 13, after supper, they went to the Mount of Olives, according to Mark 14:26, where soldiers led by Judas Iscariot found and arrested him. These are the verses 43, 46. Shortly before dawn, the Sanhedrin met to formally charge Yahusha and have him delivered to Pontius Pilate. John uses Roman reckoning of time in John 19:14 to inform us that Yahusha was standing before Pilate at 6 a.m. or the 6th hour from midnight, the start of the Roman day, even in those times. This was also the time that the rooster crowed to usher in the Passover day with a new light. By 9 a.m. that Passover morning, the 3rd hour from daylight on Abib 14, Wednesday, according to Mark 15:25, Yahusha, along with 2 criminals, had been led to a hill on the outskirts of Jerusalem and crucified. Also remember, from noon until his death, at about 3 p.m., there was complete darkness over the entire area, according to Mark 15:33 to 37. In the evening after sunset, Mark 15:42, Joseph of Arimathea sought an audience with Pilate and requested that Yahusha's dead body be raised to him for burial. See verses 43. After summoning the centurion in charge of the executions to ascertain that Yahusha was really dead, Pilate gave Joseph permission to take and bury the body. It was after the time when Joseph went and bought linen. Mark 15:44 to 46. Luke, in his Gospel, emphasized that the burial was hurried and took place just before the unleavened bread Sabbath drew on, as the dawn light encroached upon the last hours of the Passover day. Luke 23:53, 54. Compare John 19:41 to 42. This emphasis that Yahusha was hurriedly buried shortly before the weekly Sabbath began has confused many people into thinking that the crucifixion took place on a Friday. Many readers overlook John's explanation that this Sabbath was a high day, John 19:31. This was not a weekly Sabbath. It was an annual high day Sabbath. Remember Abib 15, the day after the Passover, was the first holy day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first of 7 annual holy days commanded to ancient Israel. Leviticus 23:5-7. There were actually 2 Sabbaths that week, an annual holy day on Thursday and the regular weekly Sabbath on Saturday. Notice Mark's statement. Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, that they might come and anoint him. Mark 16:1. Shops in Jerusalem would have been closed on both the weekly and the annual Sabbaths. Yahusha was buried right before the annual holy day Sabbath began, and the women were present to observe his burial was done properly. Mark 15:47. Their first opportunity to buy and prepare spices would have been on Friday when the shops reopened. Note that Luke explains it was after the women prepared the spices and fragrant oils, a job that would have taken hours, that they rested on the weekly Sabbath according to the commandment. Luke 23:56. This understanding is correct, and the only way the events of the Gospels will align with the Torah covenant calendar. Question: how could they have waited until after the Sabbath to buy and prepare spices, as Mark clearly states, yet rest on the weekly Sabbath after they had prepared the spices, as Luke clearly states, unless there were actually two Sabbaths in that week? Understanding this point is the key to understanding the duration of Yahusha's time in the tomb. They returned at the first available opportunity to add fragrant ointments and spices to what they thought would be his dead body on Sunday morning. Luke 24:1, the first day of the week. When they arrived on the first day of the week, Yahusha was already gone, and the tomb was open so that all could see that it was empty. The grave of Yahusha was not sealed until the morning of the 15th of Abib, on the annual high Sabbath of covenant calendar. In John 19:31 it states that the body of Yahusha needed to be removed from the cross, from the stake, because the Sabbath was about to begin, which was a high day or annual Sabbath. This annual Sabbath on covenant calendar, the first day of unleavened bread, started at dawn twilight of Abib 15, according to Exodus 12:18. The guards were witnesses to the events that followed and were the ones who informed the religious leaders of what actually happened. Matthew 28:11. From the mouth of the very gods that they themselves had posted, these leaders learned that Yahusha had fulfilled the sign of the prophet Jonah, just as he said he would. Here is a summary of what took place during Passion Week. Tuesday, Abib 13 evening, Yahusha and his disciples ate at an evening meal together, and he was arrested during that night. Wednesday, Abib 14, Passover. This is the covenant calendar preparation day mentioned in John 19:31, the day before the annual high day festival Sabbath. Yahusha appears before Pilate and is crucified. He dies at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, before sundown. In the evening, after sunset, Joseph removes Yahusha's body from the stake. Yahusha was buried according to the custom of the Jews, John 19:40. This is a very lengthy process before Yahusha was placed in the tomb just before the dawn light drew on to usher in Abib 15. Thursday, Abib 15. This is the highest Sabbath, the first day of unleavened bread. According to Matthew 27:62, the chief priests met with Pilate, Matthew 27:62-66, to secure a guard. Friday, Abib 16. Yahusha's female followers purchased spices and prepared them. Saturday, Abib 17. Resurrection, the weekly Sabbath. All rested and did no work. Then Yahusha was resurrected 72 hours after he died at the ninth hour, or 3 p.m. Roman time, counting from Passover, Abib 14. Sunday, Abib 18, Wave Sheaf Festival. Mary Magdalene, by herself, according to the Gospel of John, went to the tomb and found it empty at approximately 3 a.m. Roman time on the Roman Sunday morning. John 20 verse 1. Note, John uses Roman reckoning of time only for the Passion events, so that means that John 20 verse 1 must be understood correctly. Using the timing of covenant calendar, this would have been the closing hours of the Saturday Sabbath, just before the first day of the week began to grow light. But on Roman time, it was already known as early Sunday morning. There's one verse which seems to tell us that the Messiah rose on the first day of the week. That verse is found in Mark 16:9, where Mary Magdalene sees her risen Savior. John 20:11-18. Please note the following very carefully and exactly which words are in italics, meaning they have been added by someone. Mark 16:9. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. Note, we are not going to expound on this passage in detail, as it is another huge study. However, do compare verse 9 to verse 6. Mark 16:6. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Yahusha of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. For extra help, a proper word study has to be done on the words, number 1, risen, verse 6, and application to Yahusha's rising from death, which we now know happened on the seventh day of the week at the ninth hour. Number 2, rose, verse 9, an application to Mary and her action of rising from her position just before she heard Yahusha call to her. It was Mary that rose up from her stooped position on that Roman first day of the week. Number 3, risen and rose are two different words in the Greek. The proper definition must be chosen for the content of each passage. Number 4, then the context of the passage from verses 6 to 9 must come into alignment with the events in their order when following these simple guidelines. This makes the two verses consistent with all the four Gospels, where Mary Magdalene visited the grave alone shortly before the Sabbath ended early in the morning of Roman reckoning of time counting from midnight. She saw the empty grave with the stone rolled away, but did not see the angels or Yahusha until later, after she had called Peter and John to come and see. Once Yahusha met her, he did not allow Mary to detain him, to be late for the wave sheaf ascension. However, he commanded her to go and tell Peter and John and the rest of the disciples that he had met with her. He left just before the first day broke the daylight of Sunday morning. Much later, when the sun had risen on Sunday morning, another group of women, Mary the mother of James and Salome, arrived at the tomb. These women saw the angels and heard that Yahusha was risen, and then given instructions to give the news to those in the city. Now for some history. Yahusha performed the sign he said he would, rising on the third day from his death, the weekly Sabbath. This idea that Sunday is the Lord's day is a fabrication of the Bishop of Rome. Bishop Sixtus instituted this teaching at Rome shortly after the death of the Apostle John. Later bishops of Rome perpetuated the error he brought into the church. In due time, even the keeping of the Passover remembrance on the evening was outlawed with excommunication. Bishop Sixtus, his name is also spelled Sixtus, was the first recorded individual to prevent the proper observance of the Passover and to celebrate the sacred mysteries annually on a Sunday. Irenaeus speaks further of him, declaring that his doctrine was in direct opposition to the practice of the remainder of the churches. As mentioned, Bishop Sixtus was living at the beginning of the 2nd century, just after the Apostle John died. Notice too that Easter Sunday did not begin with Peter or Paul in the 60s AD, but with Sixtus in the 2nd century. Here you have the astounding origin of Easter Sunday in the Western churches. Together with this practice, the sacred mysteries were also observed every Sunday. This is from this website, climbthewall.com. Here is another question. Why didn't the women try to anoint the body of Yahusha on Friday, since they had prepared the spices and perfumes on Friday before the weekly Sabbath began? It is because in Matthew 27:62 to 66, Pilate had given the order to have the grave sealed on Thursday morning, and they had put the Roman seal on it and posted guards until the 3 days were complete. The completion time would have been on Sunday morning. There are many more events and details that could be considered in Yahusha's Passion Week. The questions as to Yahusha's Resurrection Day and First Ascension Day have already been answered. Each reader is encouraged to understand these basic events and how they align with the covenant calendar of Torah, given by our Creator and honored by Him in the Gospels. What was the only sign given? The scriptures state in Matthew 12:38 to 40. Then certain of the scribes and of the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. But he answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. As Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. We have a choice. Believe it or not to believe it. The topic about the Wednesday crucifixion and the Sabbath resurrection may not affect our salvation, but it does answer the question on whether Yahusha kept his word, and if he was truly the promised Messiah. You can know the truth. Please give us a thumb up if you agree with this message. This message was prepared and narrated by myself. It was edited by Charlene Forge. If you want to contact me, go to Malachi4.4 at Reagan.com or go to my website at thefigtreegeneration.net or thefigtreegeneration.com. Shalom.